G'day. Welcome back to our Halloween special. How about a Scottish ghost story? My family come from Scotland, so this isn't cultural appropriation. So let's look at a ghost story from Scotland right now.
This is what's left of Vernelt Castle. There's a local legend that it's haunted by a horrible headless ghost. They say he'll appear for a glass of Bell's Scotch. He can't resist Bell's. It's been blended with their finest single malt whiskies for 150 years. Come to think of it, he's no got a head for drink.
The ghost has no head, so no Scotch for him. But the Scottish ghost story I really wanted to tell you about comes from this ultra rare book called, appropriately enough, Scottish Ghost Stories, with this handsome fella smiling on the front, in front of some kind of castle. I once went to Edinburgh Castle, and coincidentally enough, our story takes place in the fair city of Edinburgh. And it's called Jane of George Street. Might be a romantic story. Sit back and relax. Jane of George Street, Edinburgh. I was walking in a leisurely way along George Street the other day towards Strunnell's, where I get my cigars, and had arrived opposite number redacted, when I suddenly noticed just ahead of me a tall lady of remarkable graceful figure, clad in a costume which, even to an ignoramus in fashions like myself, seemed extraordinarily out of date. In my untechnical language, it consisted of a dark blue coat and skirt trimmed with black braid. The coat had a very high collar, turned over to show a facing of blue velvet. Its sleeves were very full at the shoulders, and a band of blue velvet drew it tightly in at the waist. Moreover, unlike every other lady I saw, she wore a small hat, which I subsequently learnt was a toque, which one white and one blue plume placed moderately high at the side. The only other conspicuous item of her dress, the effect of which was, on the whole, quiet, were white glace gloves, over which dangled gold curb bracelets with innumerable pennants. Shoes which were of patent leather, with silver buckles and rather high Lewis heels, and fine blue silk openwork stockings. So much for her dress. Now for herself. About time. Maybe he isn't a fashion ignoramus as he claims. She was a striking fair woman, with very pale yellow hair and a startling white complexion, and this later particularly so impressed me that I hastened my steps, determining to get a full view of her. Stalking much? Passing her with rapid strides, I looked back, and as I did so a cold chill ran through me. What I looked at was the face of the dead. I slowed down and allowed her to take the lead. I now observed that, startling as she was, no one else seemed to notice her. One or two people obviously, though probably unconsciously, possessing the germs of fission, shivered when they passed her. But as they neither slackened their pace nor turned to steal a second look, I concluded they had not seen her. Without glancing either to the right or left, she moved steadily on, past Moulton's the confectioneers, past Perrin's the hatters. Once I thought she was coming to a halt, and that she intended crossing the road, but no, on, till we came to D Street. Redacted once again. Well, we want to protect the innocent in these fairy stories. There we were, preparing to cross over, when an elderly gentleman walked deliberately into her. I half expected to hear him apologize, but naturally nothing of the sort happened. She was only too obviously a phantom. And, in accordance with the nature of a phantom, she passed right through him. A few yards farther on, she came to an abrupt pause, and then, with a slight inclination of her head, as if meaning me to follow, she glided into a chemist's shop. She was certainly not more than 6 feet ahead of me when she passed through the door, and I was even nearer than that to her when she suddenly disappeared as she stood before the counter. I asked the chemist if he could tell me anything about the lady who had just entered his shop, but he merely turned away and laughed. "Lady," he said, "what are you talking about? You're a bit out of your reckoning. This is the 1st of April come. What do you want?" I bought a bottle of Formamints and reluctantly and regretfully turned away. That night I dreamed I again saw the ghost. I followed her up George Street just as I had done in reality, but when she came to the chemist's shop, she turned swiftly round. "I'm Jane," she said in a hollow voice. Jane, only Jane. And with that name ringing in my ears, I awoke. Some days elapsed before I was in George Street again. The weather had in the meanwhile undergone one of those sudden and violent changes so characteristic of the Scottish climate. The lock gates of heaven had been opened and the rain was descending in cataracts. The few pedestrians I encountered were enveloped in mackintoshes and carried huge umbrellas, through which the rain was soaking and pouring off from every point. Everything was wet, everywhere was mud. The water splashing upwards saturated the tops of my boots and converted my trousers into sodden sacks. Some weather isn't fit for dogs, but this weather wasn't good enough for tadpoles. Even fish would have kicked at it and kept in their holes. Imagine then the anomaly. Amidst all this aqueous inferno, this slippery, sloppy filth, bass-pating inferno, a spotless, clean apparition in blue, without either waterproof or umbrella. I refer to Jane. She suddenly appeared as I was passing the Ladies' Tea Association rooms. Walking in front of me, she looked just the same as when I last saw her, spick and span and dry. I repeat the word, dry, for that is what attracted my attention most. Despite the deluge, not a single raindrop touched her. The plumes on her toque were splendidly erect and curly. Her shoe buckles sparkled, her patent leathers were spotless, whilst the cloth on her coat and skirt looked as shiny as if they had been come from Keeley's. Anxious to get another look at her face, I quickened my pace. Had there been any doubt at all, after my first encounter with Jane, as to her being superphysical, there was certainly none now. Hence the phantom was not subjective, it was not illusionary, it was a bona fide spirit manifestation, a visitant from the other world, the world of earthbound souls. Jane fascinated me. I made endless researches in connection with her, and in answer to one of my inquiries, I was informed that 18 years ago, that is to say about the time of Jane's dress was in fashion, the chemist shop had been occupied by a dressmaker of the name of Bosworth. I hunted up Miss Bosworth's address and called on her. She had retired from business and was living in St. Michael's Street, Bournemouth. I came to the point straight. "Can you give me any information," I asked, "about a lady whose Christian name was Jane?" "That sounds vague," Miss Bosworth said. "I've met a good many Janes in my time, but not Janes with pale yellow hair and white eyebrows and eyelashes," and I described her in detail. "How do you come to know about her?" Miss Bosworth said, after a long pause. "Because," I replied with a certain slowness and deliberation characteristic of me, "because I've seen her ghost." Dun dun dun! Of course I knew Miss Bosworth was no skeptic. The moment my eyes rested on her, I saw she was a psychic, and that the superphysical was often at her elbow. Accordingly, I was not in the least surprised at her look of horror. "What?" she exclaimed. "Is she still there? I thought she would surely be at rest now." "Who was she?" I inquired. "Come, you need not be afraid of me. I have come here solely because the occult has always interested me. Who was Jane, and why should her ghost haunt George Street?" "It happened a good many years ago," Miss Bosworth replied. "In 1892, in answer to an advertisement I saw in one of the daily papers, I called on Miss Jane Vernelt, Mademoiselle Vernelt, she called herself, who ran a costumer's business in George Street, in the very building, in fact, now occupied by the chemist you have mentioned. The business was for sale, and Miss Vernelt wanted a big sum of it. However, as her books showed very satisfactory annual increase in receipts, and her clientele included a duchess and other society leaders, I considered the bargain a tolerable safe one, and we came to terms. Within a week I was running the business, and exactly a month after I was taking it over, I was greatly astonished to receive a visit from Miss Vernelt. She came into the shop quite beside herself with agitation. "It's all a mistake," she screamed. "It didn't want to sell it. I didn't want to sell it. I can't do anything with my capital. Let me buy it back." I apologize to our Scottish viewers, but mainly our Scottish listeners. I listened to her politely and then informed her that I had gone all the trouble of taking over the business and had already succeeded in extending it. I most certainly had no intention of selling it, at least not for some time. Well, she behaved like a lunatic, and has in the end created such a disturbance that I had to summon my assistants and actually turn her out. After I had no peace for 6 weeks, she came in every day at any of all times, and I was at last obliged to take legal proceedings. I then discovered that her mind was recently unhinged, and that she had been suffering from softening of the brain for many months. Her medical advisers had, it appeared, warned her to give up business and place herself in the hands of trustworthy friends or relations, who would see that her money was properly invested, but she had delayed doing so. And when at last she made up her mind to retire, the excitement resulting from so great a change in her mode of living accelerated the disease, and exactly 3 weeks after the sale of her business, she became a victim of the disillusion that she was ruined. This delusion grew more and more pronounced as her malady increased, and amidst her widely ravings she clamoured to be taken back to George Street. The hauntings indeed began before she died, and I frequently saw her when I knew her material body to be under restraint, just as you describe, gliding in and out of the showrooms. For several weeks after her death, the manifestations continued. They then ceased, and I have never heard of her again until now. If I remember rightly, the account of the George Street ghost here terminated, but my friend referred to it again at the close of his letter. "Since my return to Scotland," he wrote, I have frequently visited George Street almost daily, but I have not seen Jane. I only hope that her poor distracted spirit has at last found rest. And with this kindly sentiment, my correspondent concluded. So Jane died of softening of the brain, and then it was all about business, that she thought she'd be scammed out of a nice shop. It's a very Scottish legend. Terrifying, but good. And now let's listen to a classic, antique Scottish piece of music to put us in the mood. Thanks for watching.